Welcome to SHOWstudio. Sorry for the delay. London Fashion Week is running fashionably late, as always. We're here to talk about Marques Almeida. So we're going to be discussing the Spring/Summer 15 output from Marques and Paulo Almeida. One of the most exciting brands, I think, around at the moment. They're a fashion label that everyone's really excited about and have lots of acclaim both commercially and also editorially, which is really exciting. And they're sort of bringing those two things together really well. I've got a fabulous set of panellists here with me who've been racing around at Fashion Week, so taking some time out to join us. But before we kick off, I'll let you guys introduce yourselves, starting with you, Dan.
Hi, my name's Dan Thawley. I'm a freelance journalist and the editor-in-chief of A magazine from Paris.
And I'm Nick Knight. I'm the director of SHOWstudio.
I'm Gary Aspden. I'm a consultant to Adidas. I've just designed a range for Adidas Originals called Special, which I'm in the process of launching.
A fabulous range as well. It's really, really good.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I want to start by picking up on something, because one thing that I think Marques Almeida really pioneered was getting denim back on the runway, and it was a thing that became absolutely huge kind of post them, and that's what they really built their name on, was doing that really super frayed denim, and they've really kicked off a trend in that respect. Dan, talk to me a bit about why you think that why was no one doing denim before?
Well, I guess it's a fabric that has certain connotations, and they've become one element of a wider movement back towards utility and back towards workwear, and they presented a very punk vision of that, and they're continuing to do so. And I wouldn't go as far as saying that they launched this trend themselves, but I definitely say there would be a major part, particularly in London, of moving that forward, and it does have its diffusions sort of showing everywhere, and just also that technique that they've made sort of their signature has been seen a lot since.
It's interesting you talk about this idea of kind of doing stuff on a high fashion context that's really based in kind of relevant clothes, which is kind of, they always talk about that when you speak to them. They're obsessed with this idea of like a real sort of cool girl on the street, and they see luxury as being stuff that you wear constantly. And I want to kind of get your opinion on this, Gary, because obviously working with a brand like Adidas, like that's what Adidas does. It's great kind of like casual wear, if you will. And now we're seeing so much of that in a high fashion context. Do you think that there's almost an irony to that high fashion brands are now trying to capture that kind of the ease of streetwear, for want of a better term?
I think they're basically reflecting how people dress. You know, I think there's been a definite shift in the past kind of 2 decades really towards casual wear and streetwear, and there's a lot of brands that, you know, I mean, yes, Adidas, on the one hand you can say it's a streetwear brand, but essentially it's a sportswear brand that's been adopted by streetwear. And same thing with, you know, a brand like Levi's, you know, producing denim, and it then takes on different associations. And I think a lot of brands have kind of woken up to that really. I mean, it never ceases to amaze me. You know, I know I often have my rants when I come on here about sort of, you know, the crossover between sort of fashion and sport. But you know, when I see, you know, I see brands like Adidas or as almost like reference points. They've become kind of reference points to high fashion and luxury now. Yeah. And you know, it never ceases to amaze me when you'll get a shoe like a Stan Smith, and some luxury brand have clearly knocked that shoe off, and they're able to charge ridiculous amounts of markup on it in comparison because of the power of their brand.
Like Valentino.
I'm not going to name names.
You can't just make that.
No, all right, No, but there's a host of them, and you know. But then also the interesting thing, it kind of works the other way as well, because it seems like some of these kind of, you know, like sportswear brands have also woken up to that, and you've got you know, like Raf Simons recently did a Stan Smith himself, and you know, you had some people who are going, what, they're charging that for a Stan Smith, and you think, well, if Gucci can charge that for a kind of Stan Smith looky-like it, and well, charge a lot more than the Raf Stan Smith. So
But do you think this is the other way around as well? Do you think some of the sort of sports brands then look at high fashion
Oh yeah,
and take from that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I know certainly with the range that I've just designed, the root of it for me is I look at Adidas's design history as being the kind of the crown jewels, and I've got access to the crown jewels, and I'm not going to get sued over playing with the crown jewels. But I also look at luxury brands much more than I look at high fashion brands, because I just like the little touches that they have. You know, I like some of those little touches that they have that just basically elevate them. And you know, it's like I'm a fan of Loro Piana and I'm a fan of Brunello Cucinelli, but they're very conservative. But that kind of makes them ripe for adoption. But you know, it's like I've got a Loro Piana gilet, and you know, you put your hands in the pockets and it's this velvet line kind of pockets, and it's almost like, you know, you're wearing luxury when you put your hands in the pockets, just by, you know, it's those little touches that I've, you know, that have definitely had some influence on what I've been doing.
Because high fashion brands are sort of freer to be creative in that way. The sports brands, you know, its main purpose is to make something that functions on the racetrack or wherever it is. For a high fashion brand, of course, it's about luxury and feeling and all those sorts of things. So there's a what if you want, there's a bigger amount of sort of things that they try out.
Yeah. I mean, there's.
I'm just wondering, is because a lot of the high fashion brands, it's not about functionality.
Yeah, exactly.
Which of course that's key to sports brands.
Yeah.
But I wonder if sports brands would go that far as to have things which aren't about functionality, which are about.
Well, the ubiquitous like wedge trainer is such an example of that, which sports brands started to do, and you could argue that was kind of a copy of that Isabel Marant shoe that became a huge thing. And then we've talked about this before. You know, brands like Adidas were doing a wedge heel trainer.
I mean, you know, I don't think there's a high fashion brand now that isn't doing a trainer of sorts. The difference is, though, you know, when it comes to the brands like Adidas and Nike, those brands deserve some acknowledgement for the fact that they invest huge amounts of money into innovation and technology. You know, I see sportswear, for me, the term sportswear, it's not just about a deconstructed garment. Sportswear for me is about products that are developed by industrial engineers in laboratories. That's sportswear in 2014, because it's become such a sort of broad catch-all term that it almost becomes meaningless. Yeah. Because it's like, well, you know, what is what? It's brightly coloured and it's made of fleece, therefore it's sportswear. Sometimes I think, you know, it's too broad of a term now.
And also that exact situation of these luxury brands that are trying to apply a utility or a sports style to their garments, they don't carry with it the utility that those shoes and garments have. Then they're often much heavier shoes, they're much more rigid, they don't have all of those qualities that make your Nike or your Adidas as light as they are, as flexible as they are, as wearable as they are.
Yeah, if you look at, there's a new technology that's just come out now, the Boost technology, and that technology has been in development for years. You know, running shoes have used EVA soles since the 70s, and it's the first.
What are EVA soles? Sorry?
EVA is the material that the sole's made from. It's that kind of spongy material that they use in running shoes, and that's been going on since the 70s. And Boost technology's come along, and it's basically made up of. It's almost like polystyrene in the way it's made. It's lots of small balls that are kind of compressed together. But when you wear, I train in Boost shoes, and it's just a different level. It's just a completely different level. It's revolutionary in what it's doing, and so. You know, when it comes to fashion brands and sportswear, it's purely aesthetic, really, what they're doing. They're playing with sportswear aesthetics, which is, with the range that I'm doing, that's what I say. I'm very open about it. You know, I say that in the 70s, Adidas tracksuits came boxed, and it would say sports and leisure wear. And I'm saying this is essentially leisure wear. I don't particularly like the term leisure wear, but that's essentially what it is. It has the comfort of sportswear, but it's more sophisticated in the way that it looks, you know, and so it's what's happening in fashion. It's just a pure aesthetic thing, and I think that's the differentiating fact for me between real sportswear and this kind of fashion sportswear.
Yeah, is it a sign, do we think, of kind of luxury in crisis that we're seeing brands doing things that aren't involving, that are just so sort of deferential to what's happening on the street. Because it's interesting, because I spoke to Marques about this, and she made a really interesting point where I think they don't actively see themselves as subverting luxury, but she was kind of really questioning why something is luxurious if it just sits in a garment bag in a wardrobe and is made from this untouchable fabric, and it looks like it was, she said, like, you know, made by angels. She was like, I don't get that. She was like, I don't identify with that. She was like, to me, luxury is something that you wear every day. And I think there's something kind of really interesting in that idea of kind of questioning what luxury is. But then it does make me wonder, how do you justify charging a high fashion price for something when it is not, it doesn't have that kind of technical brilliance or that fabric sort of excellence that you'd expect from high fashion?
But going to Marques now, and as we start the show, I guess we should start by saying that we're not calling them a luxury brand. I wouldn't call them a luxury brand. I'd call them a ready-to-wear brand that's making sort of avant-garde contemporary.
Yeah.
It's not something I'd expect to see on a high fashion floor. It's something that goes into smaller boutiques, that goes into, you know, sort of much more youthful. And
they do keep that price point lower.
Multi-mark kind of environments. So, and I don't think their price point already warrants that tag either. So, I mean, it makes sense to place them in London's sort of burgeoning young designer bracket rather than what London's doing very well at the same time, which is much more, which is luxury and which is evening wear.
That's interesting. But I do think from an ideas perspective, you know, they actively do want to be seen as a kind of a designer brand. They want to be seen.
Oh, indeed.
Yeah.
I mean, they are, and their aesthetics so specific that it's you're buying into that.
It's interesting though, because it's something I think we see on brands that would consider themselves high fashion brands, and it kind of goes back to what Gary was saying, where you do see them doing things like a trainer and charging these astronomical prices. And what does it say about kind of the way we consume? Do you think we have got to a point where shoppers don't care so much about fabric? I don't think that's the case. I think we often think, we talk about a consumer being ever more savvy than they were, but then what's happening to luxury when people want jeans and they want to buy Stan Smith, but then they'll pay like £500 to get a Gucci Stan Smith? What's happening to luxury when that's happening? It's a big question, but
I think also it's sometimes when people, you know, when you see high fashion brands doing stuff that say references punk rock or whatever and charging ridiculous amounts of money for it, you sort of go, well, maybe it's there's a customer out there who hasn't got the confidence to wear an Adidas Stan Smith. He needs the sort of the endorsement of a high fashion brand to make it okay to wear. Just in the same way, you know, you can't go and buy just a Jesus and Mary chain tour shirt. He has to buy one that's by undercover because it just gives it that extra sort of like, you know, he hasn't got that kind of self-confidence in a way to be able to just go, well, you know.
Or perhaps even the awareness or the time to go shopping for those special pieces.
Yeah, that's interesting, I think.
Yeah, and you know, might not even possess his Jesus and Mary chain album as well.
It's
just purely aesthetic again.
Yeah. People want their denim ripped for them. They want the t-shirt like comes with holes in it rather than, it's interesting that.
But I think Marques as a brand is interesting in the way that how it does fit in with the people, that the genuine, perhaps subcultural shopper that does have that t-shirt and does listen to that music. And I think their aesthetics not aiming towards sitting next to a Valentino dress and a Saint Laurent leather jacket. It's aiming towards fitting into the everyday wardrobes of cool young kids that for them that is their cool special piece that they're you know, of the season, and that they do mix with their real Stan Smiths, and that they that it's lived, like you said, it's a piece that they live in.
Yeah. Well, another thing I want to talk about before we go to images of the show is this nostalgia that we're seeing. Because, you know, another thing if you speak to Marques Almeida about is they're obsessed with the 90s. You know, they always talk about Melanie Ward, they talk about Mitch Scott, they're obsessed with those kind of the style mags of that period, and they love models like, you know, Frankie Ritter and Kate Moss and Liberty. Like, they're completely obsessed with that, and I think that's not a new thing. I'm going to ask you about this, Nick, because I know you love Tumblr, but if you spend time on Tumblr or on Instagram, your two big passions.
Not sure I'm going to agree to that, but yes.
But you see these kind of images posted constantly, you know, like you see it a lot with your images, like things from the 90s being constantly posted. And I was wondering, again, it's a really big question and it's hard to kind of work out the answer, but like, why do we think there is this kind of this spirit of nostalgia and this passion for the 90s so much.
I find it really odd because I grew up through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and last whatever it is. So I don't find it when people say reference in the 90s, I think, what the hell was that? You know, in a way I can't quite, it's just part of the ongoing shift of different things. I think there's a danger here. We seem to be sort of wanting to put things into categories, and you know, there's this, and it's all sort of very compartmentalised, as if that's going to help us understand it, which I guess is a natural sort of human thing of trying to simplify life. Actually, life's much more complicated and much better for that. So I never really see it as a sort of great look back to the 90s. I mean, there's naturally going to be things that you like from your childhood, and I think we talked about that on one of the first panels I was on this season. Is that, you know, that moment we do the crossover between being a child and being an adult is incredibly important, and actually marks your taste probably for the rest of your life. So maybe that's just when I don't know what age they are. But I guess
that point is equally as ambiguous as the crossover from one decade to the next, because
I think
nothing stopped in 89 and started in 1990, did it?
But there's a moment where people stop being children and become adults, which I think has a very pronounced effect on their aesthetic for the rest of their lives, because I think they make certain decisions, certain aspirations and certain desires are realised at that point. You know, you're old enough to have your first whatever it is, or to, you know, own your first pair of trainers, or, you know, whatever you happen to want. And I think that realisation that you can do that, you know, is very important. I think they're probably, what are they, in their late 20s, early 30s?
And they talk about
so the 90s would be that point for them. So I guess it's just the stuff that they desired at that point. You know, so
it's a very specific part of the 90s too. I think it, you know, it all links into heroin chic and a very fashion perspective of the 90s, I guess. And
which I don't get that from it at all. Because the heroin chic thing was much more sort of down. I mean, the heroin chic thing was a load of bullshit in any case. It was a media headline invented for people who weren't really part of it, or didn't think they were part of anything to do with it. So, but I don't really see that, because their stuff doesn't feel down. It's actually quite modernist and quite sort of bold, and I don't see it as a sort of
perhaps I mean more so in terms of those models, like and those magazines. But I think there is certain elements of what they do, and certain bearing of skin and kind of these completely shredded things that for me kind of do go to that side of things.
Should we see some images from the show? We're going to also look at, I think, a looping video, but we'll start with images if possible, Liam. Okay.
We'll talk about ourselves.
The interesting thing is the 90s doesn't feel like it was that long ago.
Yeah, that's why.
No, it was.
You know, and then I get CVs from people, and I'm kind of going, "You were born when?" You know, it's like when,
that's
you
just
know,
getting old.
No,
Gary.
yes, but it is.
More.
It's like when I was going clubbing in '88 and I was 18 years old. If someone had come to me telling me how great things were in 1969, I'd have been like, "What are you talking about? Get away from me!" Even if someone had come to me saying how great things were in 1978, 10 years earlier, it was like not relevant, you know. And you know, life's kind of lived forwards, but it's understood backwards. And nostalgia originally was like a term for a form of mental illness. It's that the belief that the past is so much better than the present. And but I think, you know, echoing what you were talking about, there is that thing where you're growing up, there's a time in your life which really kind of shapes your identity and shapes your taste in a way and sets you up for the rest of it. You know, I know what mine is. I know that you know, it's like the idea of, well, that's right and that isn't. And sometimes when, you know, I see younger people and younger designers referencing the past, like, you know, because recently there was all the stuff about the 80s. And I go, oh, not that bit of the 80s. And it's almost like my friends' mums and dads, when we were going raving, going, oh God, they're all getting into all that late 60s hippie looking stuff. You know, because it's like when you were there at the time when it actually happened, really, you know, there was certain things about it that you were like, no, that was a no-no. And you know, and what happens is you get the media version of what went on back then. So it's like, oh yeah, you know, Manchester in the late 80s, it was Manchester, and everyone wore Joe Bloggs. Like, you know, you went in the Hacienda in 1989, nobody wore Joe Bloggs. Do you know what I mean? People were wearing sort of Chippy and Armani. It wasn't, So it's
rose-tinted view.
Yeah, I think that based on probably the age of these designers, growing up and the face and Helmut Lang and all that sort of that mid-90s stuff. I mean, at the moment, a lot of fashion people are going mad about gazelles again because it was that whole mid-90s Britpop thing. It's like, but it's we've had noticed recently so many people requesting gazelles all of a sudden. It's like, because it is.
I wear them a lot. Thank you, Dad. Stop looking at me.
But it is one of those kind of signifiers that was absolutely intrinsic to youth culture at that time.
I mean, it's an interesting thing when you work in fashion, because there are certain things that one hates. So I thought, actually, I really hate that, and it kind of feels like it's all accepted. But then, because you spend some time here, in 10 years' time, a bunch of kids will come along and love the thing you hated.
Yeah, exactly.
So then you have to reevaluate that.
Yeah.
And actually, that's a sort of skill. I don't know if it's a skill or just what it is, but to sort of keep on working in fashion, keep on having enthusiasm for it, you do have to sort of say, okay, well, I hated that when it first came out, but somebody else who I respect really loves it. So therefore, I got to reevaluate my thing. So I don't know if that's a skill or just a trait of being
Is that why
fickle.
you like Tumblr? That element of re-looking at imagery? Because I guess a lot of the stuff you see on...
It's not why I like. Why do I like Tumblr? Because it shows lots of things that I hadn't seen, actually. Because it shows me people's passions. I like seeing obsessions. It's interesting to... Why that make you laugh? I like seeing people who are passionate about something. And also, they can take imagery, which you do know, and the way they recombine it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's quite unexpected, and there's use of sort of typography and GIFs and animation, and it's a new visual art form. And it's like it's like the magazine, but a different version of it. So it's somebody's personal taste, and they've curated amongst the sort of global imagery available, and they've represented it to you in a way. I don't see much on Tumblr, which I think, I've seen this before, I'm bored of it. I do see obsessions on Tumblr, and there are, as you pointed out, there are obsessions with Kate, obsessions with Gemma Ward, there's certain obsessions you see on it. There's a certain obsession that runs through it of sadness, which is quite interesting. And there's actually quite a lot of sadness around at the moment. I've spoken to some friends about that. Sadness seems to become a thing, and Tumblr is often, and not always, but often the sort of the outlet for some,
propagating quite depressive
That's
imagery.
kind of
some teenager in their bedroom who haven't got access to much stuff and are fairly pissed off with the way life is. And actually, it's their sadness, and it's that sort of obsession. It's part of all of that sort of, it's like feeling the world doesn't work for you, and this isn't a reach out of this is me. Can I be accepted? And this is my vision. And then you bet the Tumblr community, etc., etc.
I think that's maybe what I was quite badly trying to get at with the nostalgia thing. Is I feel like if you go on in certain facets of the internet, and you're completely right in saying completely not all of it, but there is this sense of a kind of times were better, or things aren't great now, let's look at this. And I think maybe it is kind of going back to what Gary was saying, maybe it's as simple as kind of like the most prolific users of things like Instagram and Tumblr probably did grow up in the 90s in the way that Marques Almeida did, and they just love that imagery of Gemma and Kate. So maybe it's really natural as them just kind of sharing the points where they fitted into fashion.
I think it's also, so I'm sorry to sort of interrupt, so also you see things you don't see in magazines. You see things that magazines on the whole, not particularly yours, but a magazine on the whole will not show, like self-harm or food obsession.
Not that we love self-harm in a magazine particularly.
You see those sorts of things which are personal, and things which really go against the sort of media accepted what we can show. And actually, you're seeing things which are quite disturbing in some way. A fascination for death, a fascination. I do think it ties into sort of a global movement of that.
Even beautiful nudity as well.
So much nudity.
There's all that stuff. There's music coming out of Scandinavia, sort of sad rap. Which is actually about, you listen to, is it Spooky Black? The stuff that he sings is really sad. It's all about having your heart broken, which of course is what happens to you. It happens to you throughout your life. It happens to you a lot when you're young. So there's a lot of expression of sadness. I think that I personally has always really loved melancholy, so I'm quite happy there by sadness. But I do think that's exciting. But it's a sort of thing that the mainstream media shy away from.
That's actually what I was going to ask.
You can never get a girl on the front cover who's crying. Vogue would never do that. But most of us, women and men, cry. But that's never there. It's one of the things that I always sort of find difficult with Vogue, where they say to me, your stuff's too fantasy-based, you want more reality. So what, like car crashes, cancer, paedophilia, abuse, fights, drunkenness, is that what you want? Because that's reality.
Frank wants it sometimes at Italian Vogue.
Sometimes, but only, but so they make inroads, but Italian Vogue only sells 3,000 copies, so it's a bit like, not exactly the mainstream.
That with the 90s thing is, do you think that there's imagery was just better. Because when I went to Marques Almeida studio before this collection, I was there about 3 weeks ago, and the board that they have up there is all this kind of like great editorials from The Face and ID, and what I love about them is they're such a Tumblr generation in the sense that I asked where one of the images was from, they didn't know, they just got it off Tumblr. I kind of love that in a way that it just kind of...
That was what I was about to say, going back to also what you said about about nostalgia, because for some it's a nostalgia of things that they didn't experience themselves, and I've talked also to other designers recently who whether it's the past or it's just a part of the world that they haven't seen, or it's just their impression of an idea of things, like you were saying about the hacienda. And I think that's also a bit the way of the postmodern way of making fashion today, is that it's often not personal experience that's informing people. But I also think
it's a fetishization of London. I mean this in the best way. I've interviewed a lot of designers, and London is known for designers coming from different countries to study here, and it's a line that you hear constantly from international designers. I grew up and I was so excited to get a copy of The Face, or I was so excited to get a copy of ID. And I think to them also, like, if you didn't actually grow up in London, 90s London or 80s London, when those style mags kind of appear, does feel like, if you were experiencing it through the pages of ID or The Face or Sleaze Nation, whatever it was, felt like this amazing place. And all designers talk about it that grew up in different places, and Marques Almeida, they're Portuguese, so it's the same thing for them. And I think there is this kind of fetishization of what London was like, and those style mags I think are so pivotal, particularly to designers working in London, because often they're not from London, so they're their cultural their context for what they think London is.
I think it was amazing though. I think it really was amazing. I mean, the Face was, when the Face closed down, I wasn't, the last 12 months of the Face, I felt like I cared more about that magazine than the people that were running it. But the actual, when it actually went, it was it felt like the end of an era. And that magazine, it was really, really important. It worked on so many levels. I read it before I worked in the industry, and then when I got into the industry, if we got products in there, not only did they present it in a really, they presented things, I don't think beautiful is the right word, but they presented things really well. And also we would notice if anything went in the Face commercially, it would fly.
Well, people actually believed in what they said.
They had a voice, and we were shooting a film a couple of weeks ago. I was with Nick Griffiths, and we weren't talking about nostalgia for the 90s as such, but we were talking about how that group of people that kind of were styling and and photographers that kind of cut the teeth around that time, particularly with with Dazed and The Face and Sleaze Nation, how a lot of those people, they're still there. They're still there. I mean, the Nancy Roders of this world are just out there quietly getting on with doing Dries Van Noten and doing, like, those people have had such a legacy and such influence over the industry globally. Because, people talk about London and they go on about London as this, this great hub for culture and youth culture. And, I think from a fashion perspective, the thing that London really does well, is the styling and the photography stuff.
But I think it's such a shame, because that's just gone so much. And I don't mean this in a rude way to sort of any stylist that I'm fond of, because I think it's really just different times. But I feel like if you're a young stylist, no matter how great your ideas are, you don't have a platform to do as much in a magazine context, and you have to shoot full looks and stuff. And you kind of feel like you always hear young stylists talking about Venetia or Melanie or whoever, but then you think they just couldn't do that now. They couldn't put like a ball gown.
You can in your magazine, can't you? Your magazine is much freer in its editorial policy.
I mean, for example, in the last issue we had Iris Van Herpen as curator, but she allowed Pierre Debouchet and Robbie Spencer, carte blanche, free range in their shoot to work with her archives. But then Robbie added all of these obscure young London graduates into the mix, even the piece that we had on the cover, which was a very sort of violent golden mouthpiece by Lucy Vincini. There was no Iris Van Herpen on the cover. It was a young graduate.
That's why magazines like yours are important.
So I mean, there is platforms, but the landscape has changed.
Yeah, exactly.
And also a lot of things have been seen, a lot of things have been done, and where the innovation is not often in the styling now, is
I
it?
agree.
It's often in the format.
Yeah, I think what happened though as well with the Knights, I don't think it's taking anything away from stylists who are out there right now, but you just had a really good lot who all came through at the same time.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's like the supermodel thing. It's a similar thing. You know, you had like this great group of models that all seem to come through at the same time. And that's not to say that there aren't great models coming through now, but you just had a lot that came through at
different times. And
and
so the stylist wasn't so recognised as it was at that point. When you had those stylists that came through, you know, they didn't have quite the same social position, which was good for the new stylists. So the Anna Coburns and the Melanie Wards and the Nancy Rose and all that, you know, they were a new breed. They weren't so sort of it wasn't something that you had to sort of have a fixed position. They were basically kids doing
and
what they
learning
wanted
on
to
the
do.
job as well, which is really important.
Which gave them a kind of honesty and a freshness. Yeah. But it wasn't styling wasn't the thing. I mean, I remember at the end of the 80s, virtually everybody was a stylist.
Yeah.
You know, but before that, there were only a few around, and it wasn't such a. You know.
And there was that issue that stylists didn't used to be credited on photo shoots. No. Who talks about that?
But it's like, you know, the things change in fashion. You know, at one time the models would do their own hair and makeup. You know, these things do change. So stylists was a kind of end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s explosion, and you got a lot of good ones came through because it was accessible. That scene was accessible. Anybody could become a stylist, which was good in the way that the good ones came through, but also there were a lot of ones that didn't come through.
But there's a couple who are such absolute genius talents from that time and from the end of that time that have come through today, and I'd have to say, for me, Panos Ioannis is one of those who is just maniacally embroidering and putting together all these incredible custom pieces for his shoots still. I mean, Nicola Formichetti came at the very end of that, but he also was informed by that era himself and carried it into a new generation too. So I mean, there's, I guess, perhaps a lack of that fervor and that drive to do things that are as insane today. I mean,
I think that the context of the times as well, you know, that things have changed so much from the 90s, where you know, when you were saying about the face was an honest voice of endorsement, because you knew that the face, if they put it in there, it was because they liked it, and it wasn't kind of just like a paid out advertorial sort of with, you know, GQ promotion stuck in the top corner of it. It was you know, it was an authentic voice. But now it's like the context is that, you know, you've got so many voices now because of the internet and the digital explosion. It's, you know, people, I think magazines are still important and still relevant, but at that time they were like the only voice. It was the magazines were the voice, and now you're getting the
and you trusted that they were the coolest
but
people.
Also before that the magazines were very few and far between. When I first came on the scene, which is the end of the 70s, you know, I had to go and see Cosmopolitan to take my portfolio, which was pictures of skinheads at the time.
How did that go?
Very badly. They said, well, them or Harper's and Queen said, no, we only take pictures of pretty girls. Thank you. So that was the end of me. But you know, when the Face and ID came out at the beginning of the 80s, you know, they were the only two for 10 years or so. I mean, you know, obviously Sleaze Nation, some of the magazines' days stuff happened in the 90s, or more towards the 90s. But there really wasn't that choice. What we have now is such a huge choice of mediums to express ourselves through. And there is an ongoing debate, which, you know, is what's the purpose of the magazine anymore? And I slightly take your magazine out of this fray, because I don't think it's quite the same as the magazines that I'm talking about. The magazine's original purpose was there to report what happens in the fashion shows, and that's already being seen live. So why are we looking to a magazine that then comes out 3 months after that? Also, magazines exist, like most things, this is a business. Magazines exist because they make money, and the advertisers put their, you know, their £100,000 ads in the front of magazines. But the circulation of magazines is falling, and the advertisers decide, well, actually, I'm going to go to bigger circulation, which is the internet. Then the magazines just evaporate. So we can all say, oh, well, the Face was great, or, you know, Jill magazine was great, or whatever it is. But if they don't have the support of the advertisers, they will go.
But do you think that's? I don't think it's just because of the internet. I also think it's because of this honesty of voice issue, where I don't think if you buy a magazine anymore, you trust it in the same way, you know, like...
Well, that's because the magazines, and again, Dan, I'm taking yours out of this general critique.
Well, there's several that can be taken out.
Yeah, there are a few that can be taken out.
But the general thing is, the magazines have to hold on to advertisers. They're not going to rock the boat. They're not going to not put Mr. Armani's ad on the front cover, or you know, whoever it is. might be completely different, but whichever brand puts a lot of advertising in that magazine, they're not going to go against them, because otherwise they lose their sense of their source of income, and they don't exist. And then we get into all the things which I don't know Dan can tell us anything about, which is the absolute travesty of magazines saying they sell 100,000 when they're selling 1,000.
Yeah, it's just awful.
The number of stories I've been told about warehouses full of magazines, about sending magazines to the Eastern Bloc countries that don't send them back so they can chalk up the circulation figures. That is fine, I understand that people want to make a business, but it's also a travesty, because
it's
for young photographers
really
who were saying, okay, fantastic, I'm going to work for this magazine because they have a circulation of 60,000 or 80,000, and they don't, that was in some way a deceit. And I think that's left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. So when the other option becomes available, which you can express yourself through the internet, through websites or Tumblrs or whatever else it is, people will go to that because it does feel more honest, it does feel more direct. You're not being told that you can't put that picture of that girl because she looks a bit sad. So obviously, there's slightly magazines are really having to justify why they're here anymore. And so they have to be good, like Dan's, to justify.
So buy a magazine.
Yes.
One thing I do want to ask, because I'm just intrigued, I've never asked you about this, and you're not a very nostalgic person, but do you, because obviously you worked with Terry and at ID for a while, and you kind of had that amazing time. Do you miss those magazines?
No, I don't. I don't miss those magazines like I don't miss conversations I had yesterday. I've done what I needed to do with those magazines. I enjoyed it while I was doing it. It was a challenge and exciting. I certainly don't miss them. It really doesn't feel appropriate for how I live my life. To be honest, I find it very hard to have the enthusiasm to open a magazine anymore. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but the way an image looks still on a page, not backlit, doesn't excite me. And I find the amount of rubbish I have to look through in a magazine depressing. The amount of bad editorial, the amount of compromised advertising. I find that the situation, the way it's presented, the stuff around it, is actually very detrimental to any good stories that are in there.
Yeah.
So I don't enjoy the experience of having a magazine anymore. I don't enjoy the experience of carrying one. I don't enjoy the experience of looking at one. I don't have that point of the day where I sit down in a chair and look through a magazine. I really don't know who does. I don't have that moment in my day, so I'm on my phone or look at things because that's how it fits into my lifestyle. So I don't miss going back to that way. That doesn't take away from when I was doing it. I loved it. Thought it was brilliant. Thought magazines would change the world. Thought what I was doing being seen by thousands of people, it was really, really important. So yes, I loved it when I was doing it, and I was, one would follow other magazines, and it felt like there was a conversation going on between different photographers. So you'd do one set of pictures, and then somebody would respond to it a couple of months later. You felt there was a conversation going on. That really doesn't happen anymore.
But it does happen on Tumblr, because we've talked about this. You see your images shared by random kids, and they're putting them next to weird things, and that's kind of taken over, hasn't it? And that is exciting.
I think it brings a whole interesting issue. I'll stop monologuing.
No,
it brings a whole interesting issue of copyright and who owns what, and whether actually it isn't about owning things anymore. It's about speaking, and we speak through our writing or our pictures or our designing, whatever it is, and that's it. And it's a public communication, and therefore other people can pick it up, use it, change it around, send it back to you, etc., etc. I'm particularly keen on the whole aesthetic of the internet of sharing. I actually think it's something that's overlooked on the internet. It's based on sharing, which nothing else has really been based on that two-way sort of communication for. And I find that really exciting. It's much better to have a conversation. So you never find it
annoying if you see your image on a Tumblr and they've cropped into it or put it next to something weird or?
No, those things never upset me. I'm not particularly, not really. I'm trying to think when I find it annoying. I usually find it annoying when it's somebody else's image who's got my name underneath it. That I find a little bit annoying. I didn't take that.
No. Especially if it's someone who's ripping you off as well, and then they've got.
I don't mind that either.
Should we look at what Marques Almeida did? This is such an interesting discussion. I feel like I could go on forever. But let's have a look. It's interesting because I don't want to give too much away, but having chatted to them before. While they were doing this collection, Marta was saying that they were making all the samples and they made them in the blue denim that we're used to seeing from them. And they were looking at the kind of the sketch, and all she could do was colour everything in black. And she was like, I just can't explain it. She was like, everything has to be black.
Is it black or is it that really deep indigo?
It's black. And I loved, it was actually really pleasant to hear her talk like that, because they've had, after their last show, they doubled their stockists. So they are at this point that's really kind of pivotal for them. And she was still talking about the collection in the way that a student does. She was like, we just need to do it. We have to do it. And I kind of love that passion still.
Well, they have had quite a change over the past couple of seasons, which might also attribute to what Nick was saying, how it's sort of quite far away from that distressed denim that they started with.
Completely.
Because, we've seen bright coloured feather boleros and like iridescent organza bra tops and all sorts of things that once they hit the runway, that from moving from the presentation side of things, that they did, you know, move from this kind of small denim capsule to collection to trying to, you know, flesh out some sort of a wardrobe.
Yeah. But it's still a sense of undoneness, which I think is interesting, because we were talking yesterday, and I really want to get your opinion on this, Gary, because I made this statement yesterday, and then I think it's probably the most intelligent thing I've ever said. But I was like...
Do say it again.
Again then. We won't be getting any gems like that today, so...
I'm totally kidding, but we were looking at, I think it's the Erdem show, which was a beautiful show, and I don't mean this to sort of as a criticism to that, but I said that fashion feels unfashionable, and I do think that's the case where people don't want to look done, and they don't even want to really look like they spent any money. I think people want to look kind of like, maybe that's going back to the Gazelle and Stan Smith popularity, they want to look cool and they want to look like it's something they've had hanging around for ages.
But people is a very big word.
Yeah, that's very true. But I do think there's a sense of kind of, perhaps you're right.
Young people.
Young people, they want to look authentic and they want to look cool and they want to look...
Well, cool by definition is when you're not breaking a sweat. If you're cool, you're not breaking a sweat. So anybody that's trying to be
cool... You're really good with your word history. I love this about you. You're really good with your word history.
No, but it's like, you know, anybody that's trying to be cool, just by virtue of the fact they're trying to be it or not it.
Yeah.
So, you know, this... And I that word... Oh God, you know, the amount of presentations I've sat in with brands where you know, it's like we want to hit the cool kid, and you're like, well, cool's a subjective thing. Yeah. You know, and you know, it amazes me with fashion, because the people who really get locked into the fashion circus, who have zero objectivity around designers and don't necessarily understand cultural references of what they're into. So, you know, if you feel there is a movement towards that, I think that's an exciting thing, really. Yeah. But, you know, I think authenticity, you know, it comes from experiences more than it comes from commodities. Yeah. You know, that's one thing I always notice when I travel to Tokyo. I always get a sense that they try to commodify experiences. Yeah. You know, there's all these kind of, you know, they'll take something like, you know, skinheads or punks or whatever it is, you know, ravers or grime kids, and they kind of they want to get the look, but without the experience. And you know, the whole thing about youth culture and the energy of youth culture is about going and doing those things. It's about going and breaking into a warehouse and having a rave, or going and climbing over a fence and painting the side of a train, or whatever it might be, that, you know, going out there and actually living and having experiences. And I think one thing that has happened over the last kind of, you know, with this explosion of the digital era, for its plus points that Nick's talking about, I think the downside of it is you've seen there's been a lot of spectators and not a lot of players. That's why I love club culture. That party we went to last night, it was fun, because it's kind of what club culture does.
Where were you last night?
We went to a party.
Yeah, we had a great time.
We didn't see it, but we were in the same party. But the thing, you know, I don't go out that often these days, but the thing that club culture does is it turns the spectators into players. Yeah. Because you know, you go out and you interact with something, rather than just sitting looking at a hype site and putting ugly critical comments underneath everything that you see on there. You know? And so yeah, I think if there's a movement towards authenticity, great, but you know, you don't get authenticity from commodities.
Maybe that's the problem, is that maybe there's a movement towards the appearance of authenticity. Indeed. But it's tricky, isn't it? Because I agree with you. Like, I love all things digital. Obviously, I wouldn't work at SHOWstudio otherwise. But I do think there's that downside to, as you say, the digital, where people don't live their lives; they appear to live their lives. You know, and they curate their lives online. And you see that there was that great thing that was kind of doing the rounds on the internet about a week ago, where that girl pretended to go, did you see this? She pretended to go on like a month-long
Thai adventure, was it to Thailand?
Adventure.
And she completely fabricated an entire Facebook or Instagram feed.
She told her whole family that she was
snorkeling pictures of eating, you know, local food, everything, and she was still in Holland.
Yeah, she literally just stayed where she was, and she shot it all, and it was, I think she was doing it for her dissertation. It's a bit of a copy of a thing that was done actually like a couple of years ago. And it was to make the point of how easy it is to convey an experience online that actually isn't happening to you at all. And all of her family thought she was out there.
All fascinating. I mean, it's all good stuff. We've done several projects on that where, do you remember there's a project we did called Don't Bother to Knock with Beige Argento, where she proposed to put a video diary, but actually it was a scripted story. And actually, you know, when people, her fans followed her, and of course we let the story go more and more and more into the fantasy. And people, you had to let the audience had to decide at what point they stopped believing in this story. So, but we should put it back to Marques Almeida.
Well, I was going to say
some very interesting things happening on.
But is that a criticism we could make of this? Because I love the pieces, but could you say that, you know, to have something that's kind of aping that authenticity of the 90s, that idea of this cool girl wearing her boyfriend's jeans all ripped up, and just packaging that and selling it, is there a criticism you could make of that?
Depends who buys it and why they buy it. In the end, it's a proposition that's being made by these designers that believe in it 100%, and it can depend on what country they're in, what store they're in, what associations that customer wants to make of it themselves. I wanted to second the Tokyo argument with a trip that I did to Moscow last year, and to see in, you know, polished restaurants and cafes, boys and girls sort of in Hedi Saint Laurent and in Givenchy flannelette shirts tied around the waist with fancy baseball caps and Chanel backpacks and everything, and they're completely sort of epitomizing an American skater look, or quite a, you know, a 60s sort of Dolly Boyd look or what have you, and they have absolutely no connection to that culture, that feeling at all, and they might even not even actually have that link to trying to be that look. They've just mixed the Rick Owens with the Givenchy with the Chanel.
That's that's been happening in Japan, in Tokyo for ages. I'm going back in the 80s, there was a place, unfortunately my memory can't recall to me, where, you know, they would go and you'd have fantastic Japanese versions of rockabilly and the 1950s America.
But it's almost like that is, you know, referencing the image, whereas there in other places it's almost accidental, if that makes sense. It's just like them absorbing the fashion and becoming a look that they don't even realise they're becoming.
They don't realise what they're actually referencing in what they're wearing.
Whereas
they're
in
just
Tokyo it's a bit more like...
It's a fashion. But I think, you know, this thing of, you know, boiling the bag authenticity that you're talking about, I think it's fine. I mean, I think it looks great. I
love it,
you know, I think it looks really good. I think it's about how it's executed, really. You know,
and this is their real experience as well. I think, you know, they do, as you say, really passionately believe in this like real cool girl, and they're obsessed with her. And they talk about when they design, they don't like sketching and trying to replicate that into a garment, because they say, you know, all that sense of authenticity goes. So the way they design is they think of a girl and then they're like, what exact jeans would that girl wear? What exact jacket would that girl wear? And that, I think that is an interesting way of kind of approaching.
So their cuts and their lengths are very interesting. And how they're sort of, you know, changing things. There's a lot of different proportions in being offered by them.
But I kind of like it because it feels like everything is kind of falling off the person. You know, there's this real sense of kind of, and it goes back to that undoneness.
This is very different, I understand.
The colour blocking seems very coherent with a lot of other designers we've seen this week.
Thomas Tate was doing
Thomas, Roxander.
But it's interesting also because last season, I think I read this in Elle, they talked about how they were looking at Galliano and Lacroix, and they were saying how they didn't really get it, but they felt important to kind of challenge themselves. And I think they are trying to broaden their vision a little bit and think about kind of...
What do you mean?
Because they were saying how they were just looking at the kind of the Galliano and Lacroix shows and that opulence, and then trying to take elements of that. So do you remember that sweater from last season that just had like the individual ostrich feathers kind of sewn on it? They talked about this idea of like looking at a kind of a Galliano piece where it would have been like a horse's head covered in ostrich feathers and like constructed as a cape. But what they did instead was just splatter kind of... So they're taking elements of that opulence.
Which was because it looked like pulls in the sweater. So it looked like, but actually it was luxury. It wasn't. It looked like a mistake or a garment that was kind of being broken, but actually it was a sort of addition of an ostrich feather as a luxury thing to do.
Exactly.
I think they're very clever. And I do like
You really like them, don't you?
I do like them a lot, and I like what they're proposing. I think people will buy into sort of the idea that it's a bit like having friends, you know? You like them, therefore you like a whole bunch of stuff about them. So if they propose to you something which perhaps if somebody else proposed to you, you wouldn't accept, if you're a Marques Almeida fan and they propose something to you, you're more likely to accept it by them because you like what they do. And I very much like what they do. I think they're super interesting.
And you're following the history and the context.
And you trust their world. It's interesting what you're saying about the face and that notion of like actually believing what they said to you. I think Marques Almeida, you do get this sense where they propose something and you, even if aesthetically, like look number 35 is not something that aesthetically would immediately appeal to me, But
because
I feel
it's by
like
them.
Well, it's not just because it's by them, it is that, but it's also because I trust that its roots come from something I'm interested in, because I also love the 90s. I love undone looks, I love denim, I don't like dressing in a kind of girly done way. So even though that's a bright look and it's not the palette that I'm drawn to, I trust that that look comes out of something that I do like. Yeah. If that makes sense.
Is it a little bit, sorry, I'm rambling away. Is it a little bit like back in the sort of 60s and 70s, people would have pop stars identified with? Yeah. So it was Bowie or it was Jagger or whoever it was. You'd endorse everything they did. Yeah. And we'd seem to be in a similar situation, do we not, with designers? Yeah. So everything that Marques Almeida do, some great fan of theirs, we'll just endorse the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting.
What I found interesting about this collection is that, based on the conversations we had while we were waiting to see it about the 90s, I didn't see anybody in the 90s who looked like that.
No.
Yeah.
So, which I'm quite pleased about, because it shows that yes, they're taking the spirit and influence of it, but actually contemporising it. I don't want to see the 90s again. I've seen it.
Well, they're not replicating, they're trying to take mood.
That's what I mean, and I think that's far more interesting to me than somebody just trying to sort of do an off the peg, hey, this is how people dressed in 1997.
Yeah, completely.
When,
Are we going to see a video?
Yeah, we're going to hopefully see the video, which is...
Why does it say Topshop Cafe?
Because it's in the Topshop show space.
Really tacky, it's like a duty-free lounge.
That's what pays for their show.
Yeah. We shouldn't bash Topshop, they do great support.
We could perhaps help them address their aesthetic. That vision is not a vision.
We'll dress the show space next time.
Unrecognisable in any provincial airport.
It's interesting, I'd like to talk about this, because Gary just raised something that I found really intriguing, which is this idea of designers that are led by... Hang on, wait, is this... I don't think this is Marques Almeida, love.
That would have been interesting.
Maybe skip on a bit more.
It's a looping video, so I can't.
Can you not? Yeah, let's go back to the pictures. Never mind, we tried our best.
What were you intrigued by?
I was intrigued by designers who are led by mood rather than by an aesthetic, because I think we often talk about how that happens less and less. You talk about designers being led by individual garments, and you could talk about someone like Galliano being led by a mood and a narrative and a story. But I think that's quite a rare thing in fashion. Do you not? You don't look like you agree with me.
Sorry, I'm really concentrating on the detail shots that have just come up. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I was asking about designers that are led by mood. They're led by a feeling rather than being led by key garments, and they're trying to capture a spirit. Because I think that's quite rare. Even designers that are really, really talented.
I think it's a skill. It's a skill to be able to do that, rather than to just, because like I say, it doesn't... If you hadn't told me about the 90s thing, I wouldn't necessarily go, oh, that's a 90s looking collection. It doesn't use obvious 90s references.
Yeah.
But, which, like I say, is much more interesting.
Trying to work out what's going on with that handbag in shot 4.
Well, it also goes back to that whole idea that designers today need to have at each show like a press release that explains exactly where they started and what they ended up with and why it looks like this. Whereas I think that the reality of a lot of people is that they are inherently drapers, they are fascinated by materials, they are obsessed by a spirit, like you said, or obsessed by certain time periods and certain attitudes, and in the end they have to kind of almost reverse the process and find one particular heroine or one book or one artist and a movement, etc., to help describe
to tag it on to,
exactly what they've done. I'm sure that there's many houses and brands that end up, constructing those mood boards in reverse rather than starting from
with it,
something so specific and then turning a collection out of it. But then others can, of course, go straight from one idea and just nail it home to the nth degree.
How do you think this is a progression from work we've seen before from them?
Well, they're obviously doing their very best to lighten and move and diversify their materials. And I guess these tulle and mesh pieces we're seeing with all the ruching and ties is a way of moving away from all the denim, and also the way that the denim is just slashed to the body, and those kind of midriff tops and wider slash trousers and things.
I think it's interesting as well to see them really pushing kind of, because they had got so much acclaim for the furs that they did and those kind of pieces of skin, and it seems like they're also really trying to push themselves as a leather goods house as well, which is intriguing, because they're doing great accessories, and most young designers don't. We talked about this actually on a panel yesterday, you know, how London has lots and lots of skills, but our designers aren't great at doing a brilliant accessory, which is why Simone's brogues was such a kind of thing. But you don't think of, you know, someone like Wang as a bag guy, but you don't think of that with most of our young houses.
Well, it's a very hard thing to do, and as well we have to consider the fact that half of these people are doing it on a shoestring, and that to develop a shoe, develop a bag, develop a glove, and all of those things that people like Simone and Christopher Kane, etc., are doing so well now is because they have the means to do it.
Yeah.
And some people, like perhaps these guys at the beginning, just
don't
got there with the look, and it's hard to start it all from the beginning.
I do think they're a very interesting duo. I think it's an interesting brand, and I think also it's got longevity to it.
Yeah.
I don't think it's one of those that's just going to sort of, you know, flash in the pan. I'd love to see what they did if they were given the means to do things. So if they were given a French house or they were given an Italian house to rework.
I don't want that. I just want them to have their own thing.
But then, well, yes, but then you know, they have to, it's a long route to get enough finance just doing this.
Yeah.
So, you know, getting another house to work on is a sort of shortcut.
So you do think like Margiela, they'd probably do amazingly, because they do have this kind of eclectic vision. I just like this notion.
But I think they reference it themselves a lot.
Completely,
so
I just like that you know what they're about. You know, you always say this, that you think the hardest thing in being a creative person is just having opinion and knowing what you like and what you don't like. And I think that's, you know exactly what they stand for. And I think it's really a problem in fashion at the moment that it's really, really hard to say this is what this brand is about. There are very few brands that you can do that with. I think that's why Simone's successful, it's why Jonathan Anderson is successful. And you can immediately do it with Marques Almeida. You can, I know it's simplistic, but you can be like 90s cool girl denim.
Were they a part of the Ugly project at all?
No, we didn't shoot any of the stuff for
Because
Ugly.
I feel like somehow they are also grasping onto the Ugly chic sort of feeling a lot.
Well, I spoke to Paolo about this actually when I saw them in the studio, and we were talking about, I asked if he tried to make things that were sexy, because I do think that period, a lot of the images they reference, the girls look very, very beautiful and kind of sexy in that undone way. You know, like Liberty and Kate with kind of clothes falling off them. And he talks about the difference between doing something that looks sensual on the runway and doing something that is sexual on the runway. And he doesn't feel things that are intended to be sexual actually look that attractive, which is interesting if you contrast this to what we saw at Tom Ford yesterday, where that's like erotic fashion, but it doesn't look that seductive. Whereas I think this is incredibly seductive, but it's not erotic fashion. Do you know, it's not like...
You think your clog is incredibly seductive?
I think this is so sexy. If you saw a girl wearing this, you'd think it was really, really sexy. It's kind of falling off her. She looks really cool. She looks like she's easygoing. She doesn't look like she'd be really... Like, yeah, she looks like she's like run through a party and ripped her dress a bit, but she probably doesn't care.
But isn't eroticism so personal in any case?
Yeah.
That we shouldn't be trying to say whether something's sexy or sensual. It's actually, you know, because we all know from experience of fetishism, it's about your particular makeup that makes you particularly love something or get turned on by something. And that's very, very personal. Hence the proliferation of different fetishisms you see. And we were talking about, and this isn't fetish, but you know, people who have weird versions of things. So some people who don't like buttons, some people who don't like, you know, whatever it
Crumpets.
is. Crumpets. There is we employ somebody who has an aversion to collections of small holes, which is a very rare.
Nick offered him a crumpet. Can you imagine? Disaster.
But I'm not in any way trying to draw any humour on this. But what I'm saying is eroticism and sexuality is so personal. It has to be personal, which is why we only click with half a dozen people throughout our whole life. Yeah. So you know, this whole sort of brand say, "Oh, so-and-so's such a sexy model." Think, no, she's not. I work, but she's fine. But she's not. Wasn't sexually turned on by her presence.
I do think you get these sweeping kind of ideas of what sensuality is that change and grow and develop over time. And I think our notion right now of what is a kind of attractive way for a woman to dress is very different to what it was.
Yeah, I was trying to push more into the sexual part of this.
I see.
That's where I was going. Trying to take it down there.
And could I continue that by suggesting or just opening the conversation about their actual heritage from where they were grown up? Do you guys see anything continental and Portuguese about their designs?
They had a dictator until, my history is going to fail me, but a dictator until about the 1970s.
I know nothing about Portuguese history. How ignorant is that?
Our panel of experts. When was the last dictator in Portugal?
But not from necessarily a historical
But it's a
point of view,
repressive
just
thing,
more
isn't
about
it?
the...
People live in, if these guys grew up then, it would probably be post-dictatorship, therefore some sort of cultural blossoming or flowering.
I feel so ignorant that I don't know anything about Portuguese history. I'm like sitting here now
It's
feeling
great.
like a really stupid
I lived
person.
with 2 Portuguese architects for 9 months of my life.
But I'm thinking about more the sort of the ease of a kind of tropical country, not tropical, but a continental European country, something about the kind of Spanish influence, etc. I kind of...
Like that.
No, but this...
I think there's an undoneness
Latin
to it, which definitely
influence,
comes.
I should say.
Portugal's quite an odd country, and its national identity and its national psyche is quite different to Spanish national psyche. So it is quite different from that. And they did suffer from this very prolonged dictatorship, which they freed themselves from quite recently. And once you've freed yourself from dictatorship, as we can see awful things happening in the Middle East at the moment, lots of cultural things happen. There's ultimately, in some good ways, there's a huge cultural sort of blossoming that happens. And these are probably kids that grew up, at the tail end of that.
But it's interesting that they still kind of fetishise London so much as youths, that they weren't kind of thinking, because they're so obsessed with London even today, they're like, we couldn't do what we do anywhere else than London. I kind of love it, because when you're from London, you really take it for granted. You're like, oh, whatever, like, it's just London. But to them, London is this, like, it's still kind of...
Well, it would be if your parents or your brothers had lived under dictatorship.
Yeah, but
then London would be freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom to be gay, freedom to
Which I think is what the 90s represents
things.
to them, that kind of period. But it's interesting, I think, that they didn't think that, oh, we can do that in Portugal, that real sense of kind of a thirst to go somewhere, I think often.
Incredibly religious-dominated country as well. Sorry.
There's things you can take for granted about London though, aren't there? I mean, I remember when we used to go over to Trenoy, the trade show in Paris in the 90s, and it's like Paris is this fashion centre, and you would go to like the APC store, and Colette had just opened at that time, but there wasn't really a scene. There wasn't like a club culture or any of that stuff going on. There were a lot of very stylish people you would see around.
But what happens in the suburbs of Paris? Isn't that where the scene
Dan
is?
lives in Paris. Tell us about
Le
Paris.
banlieue, isn't that where it's all banlieusards? Isn't that where you kind of have all the kind of... Where was La Haine situated?
Sure, and like the catacombs, I guess there is certain... underground.
I'm talking about in the 90s. Do you know what I mean? And like London, it's like it was on so many different levels. There were so many different things going on so many different levels and so many different audiences.
I think Paris is a very sanitised centre, like an old museum, basically. The small centre of Paris, the centre of Paris, which is actually sort of from Ladbroke Grove to Holborn, that sort of size, is actually like a museum. And then outside of that, and then sort of 5 to 10 kilometres outside that, you have the suburbs, the banlieue, where you have all the immigrant populations, and of course where all the rich culture is, rather than the sort of proposed bourgeois culture of the centre of Paris. And I think that there was definitely a scene in there. In the 80s there was a scene in that, and films like La Haine came out very strongly.
I think with London, like, the scene is just so prominent, isn't it? There's so many layers to it. You can find...
But that's because we have a different geography. London isn't sanitized, doesn't have a centre that's sort of sanitised from cultural, cross-cultural references. Has very much, lots of, Ladbroke Grove and Holborn, Hoxton, Chelsea. They're all times we've had these crossovers happening.
See, I disagree with that, because with La Haine, it's like that's a film that really highlights the whole Parisian thing with hip hop culture, and Paris and France has always had a really, really strong hip hop culture, far stronger than the UK has. Whereas the UK, there have been so many other subcultures that happened since hip hop that are kind of beat driven subcultures. So from acid house and warehouse parties, you then had sort of jungle, drum and bass, UK garage, going right the way through to sort of grime recently, in the last few years, and so you had all these other kind of scenes and subcultures that were all happening simultaneously.
Well, I guess my point is, Gary, if you go to London, you see that, because socio-geography of London is much more mixed than it is of Paris. Paris, it's a band of kind of, one sort of culture surrounding a small centre. And if you go to Paris, you say, you go to Colette or where it is, you go to that centre. We all travel to the centre of Paris. None of us ever go to the outskirts of it, because there's nothing there we would go and see. But that's where most of the culture, and I think you'll find a fairly similar, active, youth-based scene. If you look around the outskirts of Paris.
Maybe. I mean, I think it's just one of those things that, particularly in the 90s, London was really, really known for. Because, travelling to, Tokyo or Barcelona or whatever, you're always going to get pockets of that. But in London, it was so much more prominent. And that, I think, fed into fashion.
Yeah.
And really, you know, that's why the face couldn't really have come out of any other major metropole.
Yeah.
You know, and what you were talking about earlier about people shooting full looks for magazines now, it's, you know, a lot of the magazines are very much going down the more sort of what was traditionally an American model of, you know, well, you shoot the full look. And it's like, well, what do you need a stylist for then? Whereas, you know, you had the IDs and the face, which were, you know, the face started out essentially as a music magazine that kind of ended up gravitating to being a fashion magazine, but its roots were in music culture and
they're very different magazines at their base.
Yeah.
Nick Logan started The Face. Nick Logan's an ex-mod. You're quite right, his thing was style. It wasn't about fashion. There's a big difference in style and fashion. Whereas Terry Jones, who started ID actually with Perry Haynes and Al McDowell, but Terry kept it running. That was about showing what was on the streets, because Terry thought Vogue were missing the point because they weren't showing what was on the streets. What was happening on the streets of London was in his opinion, was far more exciting than what was happening on the catwalks. So they're two very, very different magazines. They both just happen to come into the sort of, you know, the popular
but that's
culture
what's interesting,
at the
I think,
same
in the way
time.
they're read now, though, because if you look at a little bit to take it back to Marques Almeida, but also just if you look at the way that young kids would post imagery from that period on Tumblr or Instagram, whatever we were talking about, they will just mix stuff from ID and the face together, and they see them as the same. And I think that's interesting, is what people collectively take from a period, and that they do skip over the differences.
Yeah, but I think that's always going to happen. You look at somebody referencing the 1950s, you know, the rock and roll, you know, you mix up Elvis and Billy Fury and, you know, stick a load of people in there that vaguely, because you don't know, you
view of the 90s that has come, which you see kind of in, you know, it's interesting that you said, to me this doesn't look like the 90s, because to them this is obviously like almost a replication of what they feel the 90s was, and I find that so intriguing, whereas people have these views.
The thing that's very 90s about it is the casting and the hair and makeup. That's where I see the 90s in it. But the clothes themselves, like I say, I think it's much more interesting. It's like, you know, I was just, you know, under the impression we were going to see just a rehashing of something that I kind of lived through. You know, 20 years ago or whatever. So but you know, if you look at definitely like the hair and makeup and the casting, it is very the face. You know, the way they've kind of they've done that, and I think it works really well with the clothing as well. But that's the only part of it where I would really pin the 90s on it.
I'm super interested with their use of denim. I think that's a real, because obviously they get away from it a little bit in each collection. But I'm interested in that as a basic statement, because denim is a particular fabric with a whole bunch of social connotations to it. And to make it's a very aggressive thing to say, because it's basically, it's like leather. You know, it has those sort of, you know, it's a workwear thing, worn by the sort of lowest of the low labourers. You know. But actually, they treat it very much as a luxury material, because that's not. I mean, I would like a particular sort of denim, but it's not. It doesn't look like that. It's very hard and not at all flowing. That denim looks like it's flowing. It's been treated, etc., etc. It's actually quite a luxury version, and it reminds me a little bit of what John Galliano did with denim. Do you remember he printed it on silk?
But even if you just think about like the notion of what John Paul Gaultier did with denim, I think there is this kind of really interesting history of denim and the. Which I'm glad when they started doing denim, because I feel like people started talking about denim again, and it's got such a rich fashion history.
It has. It's one of those symbols of revolution,
maybe we should
symbols
do a denim
of revolt.
story.
Yeah,
we should think about that.
I'd love to. But I mean, all that sort of, you know, from skinheads bleaching their jeans. You know, that's something that gets taken up quite a lot. It is one of those things like leather, like the hoodie. It's a symbol of some sort of dissent. It's a symbol of some sort of, you know, aggression
but
against society.
I feel like it's lost that now,
because it comes from a sort of poor point. It comes from its prisoners' wear, its work wear. It's, you know, it's lowest of the low. So to show that in a collection, but I'm just interested. I'm not in any way passing a criticism, but I'm interested if this actually doesn't behave, or doesn't seem to behave in like the denim that, you know, it's like that. This is a treated denim.
So we're impressed.
Are they still doing menswear?
Yeah.
Perhaps in the menswear it has more of a...
I was quite taken aback actually when we started the panel and you said, you know, they've sort of brought denim into fashion, and I was kind of like, why is it ever not in fashion? Because I get Levi's year in, year out, and you know.
But that's like jeanswear, isn't it? I think it's interesting. Like, I feel like if designers, like on in a kind of fashion week runway, if they were doing denim, it was like they'd got a pair of jeans, skinny jeans done with their name on it, and probably didn't show them on the there was no one like taking denim.
Who has though? Because
like,
there must be other designers that have championed denim as material. You said Gautier?
Yeah, I think Gautier Galliano, but not recently.
Dan,
not
anybody?
like,
Yeah, Chris Van Ash just did quite a lot of, has been doing a bit of denim at Dior lately.
but again, that's like jeans wear, it's not...
But I mean, is there another designer, what was the name of that 70s black designer that did, I'm sorry, my memory's not good. There's somebody, and that reminds me more of that actually, you know, dungarees and things. I'm really sorry, I can't remember the name.
Yeah.
I just try. There must be other designers who sort of champion denim in that way.
In terms of their main.
I mean,
Well, I guess Com have done. Margiela. There must be more. Moschino early, maybe.
There's a lot of parallels you can draw though with the denim thing and the sportswear thing we were talking about earlier. You know, which is that sportswear and denim are, you know, basically staples that fashion will always reference. You know, I know I've said it on panels before, but you know, military surplus, sportswear, outdoor clothing, denim and utility wear are always going to be reference points that fashion designers are going to come back to, and that's why the brands like the Levi's and the Adidas's are always going to have an authentic voice in that you know people.
Well, is there anybody at Adidas, Gary, who's looking at this? Do they have people that look at the fashion shows?
Me?
Can I ask you?
There's a number of people. I mean, Dirk Schomburg is the global creative director.
So will he be glued to the Marques Almeida?
He'll be aware of it. He's definitely very, very fashion aware, and the guy who's the director who deals with my contracts as a consultant, he's very, very.
What did you think of? Have you seen the Alex Wang collection? Because you know it was like all shoes. Like he did a Stan Smith inspired dress. Have you seen it?
No, I haven't.
I'll show you afterwards.
But can I call out that Mary Catransu?
Yeah, did do trainers before, but this dress is literally a Stan Smith turned into a dress. It's like got a green collar, it's white.
But Mary's just worked with Adidas,
hasn't
she? She's just done an Adidas collaboration.
Yeah.
Which is.
I can't wait to see what you think about it. So we're impressed by Marques Almeida. We all like it. It's been our longest panel, which I think has given us food for thought, things to talk about.
Yeah, no, it's great.
Yeah.
I hope they feel that we've discussed the collection fairly and profoundly.
But I think it's interesting given that they're about mood and they're about themes, so I think that's a perfect way to discuss their collection. You know, they're not like Marta. When I spoke to her, she gave a quote where she said she watched a Marc Jacobs documentary recently, and he says in it, you know, designers aren't really designers anymore, they're stylists. They're about taking stuff that's already been done and kind of trying to present it in a new way. And she was like, I get that. And I think that's how they operate. And she says they're not about garments. You know, they do produce very wearable, very beautiful, exciting garments, but they're about a point of view. So I think it's the best way to talk about them.
I think that's how I got a green light on doing the capsule range that I've just done, because when I've said to Adidas I want to do this, they're like, well, but you're not really a fashion designer. And I said, well, yeah, but I do come from a design background. It's not a fashion designer you need a curator, you need someone that's got deep brand knowledge, who can kind of pinpoint the parts of your brand which are synonymous with your brand's personality and identity, which you don't always get from third-party collaborators.
Yeah. And also you can be a brilliant designer, but if you don't have a point of view and you don't have ideas, it's like, what's the point? And I think there's so much of that in fashion now where it's just garments, but it's not ideas.
I mean, that's the thing when we were talking earlier and you were saying about ID and the roots of ID and the roots of the face, you know, they presented the references alongside the fashion. You know, be that club culture or be that music culture, they presented them together. So it wasn't, you know, there was probably less room for the person that's bought the Jesus and Mary Chain t-shirt that doesn't know who the Jesus and Mary Chain are, because those magazines presented it as a package, and they presented.
Do you not think magazines do that now, though? I think the magazines
like
Dazed.
I'm not running down current magazines.
No, I'm not talking about. I'm talking more about people like Dazed.
But I think
those,
you know, those magazines in when you look at what the roots of them were, that was the essence of what it was all born out of, and fashion was a byproduct of that. Yeah. Although as time went on, they became more sort of leaning towards fashion than they were towards music and club culture. But nevertheless, that was what it was all feeding from, and that was so it had a foundation in culture, rather than just be like, oh, this season we're going to do punk rock, and next season we're going to do beatnik, and do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it was fed off something.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and
that's
also that
there's
those
something,
editors
there's a foundation, there's an authenticity in
There's
the voice
roots.
because it presented the whole package.
and those editors were each geeks in those fields, I suppose, as well.
Yeah.
Which is rare these days. I was going to say, from my point of view, I'm interested to see it all up close.
Yeah.
I think that we've had a good skim over everything, but I'll definitely go to the London showrooms in
I'm
Paris.
Buy
and
it all and wear it.
and I want to see it as well. I think it's interesting. I mean, Nicola at Diesel is kind of hosting the London showrooms this time, and he's going to have his latest Diesel tribute collection there, and I'm looking forward to see those two things in the same place, and to also see kind of how something that's essentially born of the same material and born of the same,
but I think it's from such different
is going to be very, very, very different.
But it is a kind of, but he's a modern designer, if you want, Nicola.
Yeah.
You know, coming from a similar sort of time period as these guys. Yeah, and he's working with denim, so it will be interesting to see what he does and see where he takes it.
And also how, I haven't fully grasped which brands this should sit next to in a shop yet.
I don't think they have
I know
either,
that
which I think...
For me, it makes me spark opening ceremonies straight away in my mind, and perhaps now Dover Street. I'm not sure if they have
said
it
that
at
to
Dover
me,
Street,
though,
but I'm interested because, you know, they're like the feathers you were talking about in the knitwear is quite a luxury thing, but then at the other hand, they're doing like these, you know, turned up cuffs, ripped jeans with no waistband.
We talked about the opening ceremony thing, and they said, you know, they're happy to sit next to those brands because it is that kind of like advanced contemporary thing, but they don't see themselves on the same level because it's not from a perspective of a group of designers making a product. It's a designer that has a vision. So I think they do have this idea where they're happy sitting next to, you know, like Marques or whatever, but they're also happy sitting next to kind of more product-y based designers, and they say they hope that's the newness of it, but I do see why that confuses people, because I wouldn't sit it next to opening ceremony, but then...
Yeah, like would you walk into a shop that sells Dries and Andemullemeister and things like that, and would you be able to put this next to it with Margiela, and would it look like Margiela? I'm still working.
But isn't that great that it's its own thing where you can't imagine what you'd sit it next to? I kind of love that. I think it's amazing that you can't be like, oh yes, you'd sit this right between the Dries and the Simone Rocha, and it'll be great. I love that it's kind of this weird little world.
But I think that's a brand that's starting out, and that's maybe that place will become a little bit more evident.
So we just want to see more from Marques Almeida, more denim, more 90s, and lots of jackets for loose. I'm very excited. Thanks guys, should we give them a well-deserved round of applause?
Yeah.